Thank you for joining this webinar today. My name is Batanda Vazi, and I'm the Policy Advisor at IISD, and I'll be your host for today and moderating the panel session that we have later. So we are having this webinar today as a part of the official launch of the Watson Store Part 1, explaining on how energy storage can help South Africa electricity crisis, which is a first of a two-part series energy storage report that has been being developed by ISD in South Africa. It explores how energy storage can contribute to solving the electricity crisis in South Africa and summarizes 7 key benefits of the country and gives the status quo of current plans and projects. Also looks at international trends, points to rapid growth in grid-located batteries. And then part 2 will take a deeper look into the grid-located batteries in South Africa and how to maximize benefits, minimize risks, and create a more enabling environment. So for today, we will have Richard Halsey, who is my colleague at ISD, who will provide a presentation of part 1 of this report. And then that will be followed by a Q&A. So that is why we have asked everybody to please use the Q&A function to post your questions. We will take likely 3 questions after Richard has presented that he will respond to verbally. And then following that, we'll try to respond to all questions via the chat function. And then we'll have a follow-up panel discussion. We have 3 panelists that have taken their time to join us today. We had actually 4 panelists. Unfortunately, one of those who is from Eskom was not able to make it today due to prior engagements. And then after that, we'll have an open panel discussion that will consist of direct questions, 2 questions to each panelist that they will respond to, and then 2 other questions that are cross-cutting that we'll also pose to the panelists to get their views, expert opinions, and then responses as well. And then following that, we'll have an open Q&A session where panelists will get to respond to questions that have been posed directly to them. And then we'll have closing remarks, and the webinar will likely or hopefully end at 11. So just to kick off for today, I'm going to ask Richard to present. Richard's background is in science and has been working in the climate change and energy space in South Africa over the past 10 years. He is a researcher and has covered topics in energy and just transition, with the most recent one being this report that has brought all of us together here today. Richard, take it away.
All right, thanks very much, Batandwa. Hopefully you guys can hear and see the presentation. So I'm going to dive straight in, provided my screen will move. Can I just check that you all see the screen and that it's moved on to the next page?
Yes.
Okay. So this presentation is a summary of the paper we've just released. I'm going to give a short presentation. The focus today is on the panel discussion, so the rest of the details are in the paper. Something we all well know, the electricity crisis in South Africa, that we are already got more load shedding this year than last year. So the question is, what do we do about it? One of the main challenges, another familiar graph, is that most of our electricity comes from Eskom's coal fleet, but the performance is declining. So if your existing assets aren't performing that well, and some of them are going to be decommissioned, you'll obviously need to build more power plants. And the problem we've come across there is that there are grid constraints. Now, if you look at this map, the colorful parts are where there is good renewables resources and where people would like to build projects. And the gray area is where there are grid constraints. So you can see that the grid constraints are preventing a lot of new projects. So, this sort of chain of thought leads one to realize that there is an urgent need for measures that can add flexibility, resilience, and most importantly, maximize the use of your existing infrastructure. When you add climate change into the mix and require low carbon solutions, this is where we believe energy storage can play an important role. Before I dive into talking about it, just as we said, this is an explainer piece. It's not super technical. We're trying to cover things in language that people can understand. So if you think of the electricity system here, everything on the left is basically on the grid. So although this is often called front to the meter storage, we are calling it grid storage for ease of communication. And on the right-hand side, if your storage is at a consumer premises, then it's consumer storage. The types of technologies we've got, pumped hydro and thermal energy storage have been in South Africa for a while already. What's arriving is a lot of consumers are building their own batteries in response to load shedding, and some grid projects are just getting up and running. And on the horizon, there's a whole range of technologies. Storage around the world is ramping up. So there's gravity storage, green hydrogen, other battery techs. We don't go into details, but it's just those are the type of options there are. Now, if you think of what services can energy storage provide, there is a whole list. And the point is not to worry about that now, but be aware that there are a lot of services. And this is a simple message we think needs to get out there, because if you ask the average person, can you list 15 things that storage can do? They probably can't tell you. We'd like to highlight 7 benefits to South Africa and in response to load shedding. The first one is at the consumer level. If consumers add batteries to their existing generators, which is mostly rooftop solar, this could potentially decrease demand for Eskom supply, and that will help with load shedding. A second immediate effect, which has already been happening, is that the Eskom's pumped hydro can smooth out load shedding. What we mean by this is that there might be more total hours of load shedding, but the severity is less when people need it. In other words, you might, instead of having no load shedding at night and then it jumping up to stage 5 in the morning when everyone wants it, you might have stage 3 throughout the day. Now, the next set of benefits relate to this better use of infrastructure, whether it's existing or future infrastructure. Now, if we think of existing power plants, if you are struggling to meet demand with your supply, then at any point where there's potential excess supply, whether it's late at night or on a particularly sunny or windy day, you definitely want to be able to store that energy rather than forfeiting it. And then when we think about adding new power plants to the grid, this is obviously fairly well known that because renewables are intermittent, your storage can allow them to supply electricity at a wider range of times. Now, this is what has since December last year become really prevalent in the debates is, well, what about the grid? And what storage can do is optimize your constrained and congested grids. So at the transmission level, this can effectively allow you to squeeze more out of this infrastructure while you build more. The sixth point in the bottom right is around future grid infrastructure. In some cases, not in all cases, you might be able to use storage to defer network upgrades. Now, we have to be very careful with this one. Network upgrades is not the same as maintenance. You obviously need to carry on your maintenance. This needs to be analyzed on a case-by-case basis. And from the research interviews from this work, it seems that at the transmission level, throughout the country, it probably doesn't apply, but at smaller municipal levels, in cities, it might be an option. And for example, the city of Cape Town is looking into this. The last benefit we're going to highlight is that if you think of grid versus consumer storage, grid storage improves public supply of electricity, right? And that is a direct benefit to all electricity users. Whereas if you compare that to consumer storage, there is an indirect public benefit, but the consumer storage is actually primarily designed for their own benefit. So in terms of just transition, that's where grid storage fits in. Just a little more, why are we focusing on grid batteries for this work rather than consumer batteries? Well, the first one is that consumers are already installing batteries at a rapid rate. whereas new grid storage and particularly batteries is only just beginning and at a slower rate than required. And a third point is that if you put batteries on the grid, you can reduce the use of fossil fuels in peaking plants, whether it's diesel, whether it's gas. It's just a lower carbon option, which is good. If we quickly look at some international trends, this is the capacity of storage. Although pumped hydro is the most capacity, as you see in the red box, the action is happening with batteries. Not only is it the largest predicted overall increase in the short term in the next couple of years, but it's a 550% increase over this 6-year period over what we've got. So it's massive growth. Obviously, predictions beyond the next couple of years, it becomes difficult, but in the short term, this is where there is interest. If you look at the amount of capacity that's been added, you can see it's ramping up rapidly. Then if you look at the investment, similarly, investment internationally is ramping up, particularly at the grid level, which is the dark blue in this picture. And then what's been driving a lot of this is the decrease in price, again, quite dramatic. It has leveled off over the last 2 years for a variety of reasons, but it is predicted beyond about 2024 to decrease further. And then if we move to, okay, now we're talking about grid batteries, where do they feature in South Africa's planning? Well, if all the power system models, if storage is built, it is in the form of batteries. Eskom's recent transmission development plan for 2022 tripled the battery capacity allocation over the next decade compared to the previous plan, which is a recognition of the importance of batteries. And other plans, National Infrastructure Plan, Actions to End Load Shedding, Just Transition Investment Plan, they all include batteries. The question then comes, how is it going with implementation? So, and again, this is grid batteries. The Eskom phase 1 projects, they've taken quite a long time to get going, and all of the phase 1 sites have been delayed by at least 6 months. There were also batteries included in a number of the risk mitigation projects, and 4 of the bidders, which included batteries to meet the tender requirements, haven't reached financial close. And then if we look at the integrated resource plan for electricity infrastructure, the battery component is only at tender stage, but they were meant to have already come online last year. So in terms of these, they are delayed. And that is something we should factor into thinking about batteries moving forward. So just some basic findings from this, this introductory work is that storage can already provide benefits, but you do have to be careful how it's used. For example, as I said earlier, if consumers add batteries to their PV, that can help. But if consumers only buy batteries, and particularly if they set them to charge at the end of their load shedding slot, you can actually make it worse. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done about how to encourage the use of consumer storage to also provide a positive benefit for the entire system. The second basic one, and again, to reiterate, this piece is an explainer piece about communications. It's for the wider audience, is that storage offers many services, but the knock-on from this is that stakeholders and decision makers should recognize this. And the danger is that if the narratives only focus on, well, we need storage in the future to complement renewables, you're undermining the overall value it can add to the system. The third one is that even though storage is important, it doesn't seem to have gained much direction or momentum yet. There is no energy storage strategy or roadmap. And as we've said, a lot of the national level projects have been delayed. A fourth one is just around pumped hydro, although the focus here, we are talking about batteries, is there are a number of advanced stage pumped hydro projects, for example, but it's been on hold for over a decade. Now, if it takes a long time to construct pumped hydro, it isn't a short-term solution, but these long construction times also mean that if we do need them in the future, we need to start building them now. So a thorough analysis should be done based on where we are and what the alternatives are and which projects to take forward. And our last finding is that we would like to suggest is that there are a number of reasons why batteries are a priority. If we start on the top left, they factor into least cost balancing of supply and demand. Importantly, they can be deployed rapidly. They're at the forefront of technology disruption, and they align with the sort of decentralized way energy planning is moving. And on the left, we see there's grid optimization services. They fit in with just transition because grid batteries help with public supply. And, you know, for all these reasons, we think that they should be sort of given more attention than they currently are. Now, all this leads us on to the part 2 work, which is sort of the more meaty, the more interesting bit, is we say, well, okay, if we're going to deploy grid batteries in South Africa, how do we do it? How do we maximize the benefits? How do we minimize the risks? And how do we create an enabling environment so that the projects do actually get implemented on time? And this is what the panel discussion today will focus on, with this part 1 as a background to it. So that's it from me. If there are any brief questions of clarity in the Q&A, I can quickly look to those. And then we can move on to the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was a very good presentation, and it does provide the baseline for today's discussion. It's a much needed conversation that we should be having, and it's raising important issues around understanding how load shedding can actually be resolved in the country and taking possible steps to do that. I will check now. So we do have a question from Richard Worthington, who is asking if we could have some reflection on importance of storage for the region, as well as SA to SAPP or SADC region. So I think it's just a question of perhaps reflecting on how storage could be important for the SADC region.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that question, Richard. That isn't something we've looked at specifically. Obviously, within the South African power pool, you know, there is already trading that's going on. And, you know, part of the second section of this work could be if we're thinking about how best to go ahead with batteries and storage in the country, is it worth looking at how that fits into the SADC region? So I think it's an important thing to consider, and maybe we can discuss it with the panel a bit later. We have not yet done any specific work on that yet. I'm just looking through the other question and answers if there's any ones from this presentation. Okay, so there's one here. Do you feel that distributed batteries at grid level will have better benefits than a single location grid storage? So on that question, again, some of this will be in the part 2 work we're doing, is if you want to maximize the benefits from storage, you need to locate it in the place that benefits the grid the best, or the municipality. It needs to sort of be done sequentially in the right order. And, you know, a lot of that comes down to like what Eskom have done in their transmission development plan, is that they have said, look, these are the areas where it will help us the most. So I don't think there's a blanket answer of, is it better in one area versus lots of small sites? We need to hear from Eskom or municipalities who have done the analysis of it to say, where are our bottlenecks? Where are the substations that are struggling? You know, relative to where the generators are, where is the optimal location? Okay, just trying to see, there's quite a few questions here. Maybe what we should do so that we can carry on with the panel discussion is I can start replying to some of these in the Q&A. And then I will do that while the rest of the session carries on, because there are quite a few questions and I don't want to pick one person over another. If that's fine, I'll start doing that.
Thank you so much, Richard. So we will now move on to the next session of the program. We do have in our midst 3 panelists, experts in the field of energy and battery storage, and also just managing energy at a utility scale. We do have Paul Vermeulen, we have Lesego, and we have Frank. Paul is a chief engineer at City Power in Johannesburg and has been with them for 43 years. So that's actually a very, experience that we all should aspire to. His experience includes demand-side management, energy efficiency, renewable energy, and energy storage. He's also presently a board member and the chairman of the Policy and Regulation Committee of the South African Energy Storage Association. Lesego Moshikaro is an economist at Trade and Industrial Policy Strategist, that's TIPS, with a master's degree in commerce, specializing in development economics. She has also worked as a researcher and data analyst, and her expertise lies in industrial policy, automotive manufacturing, battery energy storage systems, and in employment and skills for industry. Frank is an engineer by training with an additional degree in sustainable development. He has been working with battery technology since the early 2000s, having worked on a large battery-based microgrid in the Eastern Cape in 2003, and then many battery-based microgrid across Africa over the last decade. He worked at Bushveld Energy, helping to develop local value chains around vanadium redox flow battery technology, and at Kane Mani, he is now developing utility scale power projects that include large stationary storage battery systems. So just to kick off our panel discussion, I will pose direct questions in that order. First, directly at Paul, then Lesego, and then Frank. So Paul, where do you see the most opportunity for municipalities to benefit from the addition of grid batteries?
Thanks, Kotanwa. You know, it's a big question, and already we seem to have touched on the issue of a lot of smaller batteries being aggregated, and that's probably one of the things that an electricity distribution company should be focusing on. So for me, your question is grid batteries would imply where they are connected, but grid scale means a different thing for me completely. But I'll try and deal with the grid connected batteries first. So we've done several studies on some of our intake stations. City Power's intake stations, we've got 40 of them. Some of them are very big, 275 kV, and some of them are the small rats and mice, the sort of 30 megawatt, 20 megawatt, 11 kV intake points from Eskom. And many of those intake points get very close to their notified maximum demand limits, particularly in winter. And the penalties for exceeding your contracted demand from Eskom are quite severe. So the business case for those are very, very strong. I had a lady working for me, she did her master's, or Ipi Mwedi, on Olivedale. And the business case for that is very strong, in fact, where you install an energy storage system, you use it to clamp down on the penalty costs that Eskom would charge you, but also you would use it to reduce the quantum of peak energy that you're procuring from Eskom. So the business case is not focused on one item anymore. So remember, most municipalities, in fact, probably by next year, all municipalities will be buying power from Eskom on a time of use basis. And for many, many years, we have been using the storage capacity of electric geysers to try and shift load. at its peak, we've managed to have our ripple control system that can reduce the demand by a whopping 120 megawatts during the evening peak. And it uses the principle that you've got stored hot water in the geysers, so you can defer the energy to recharge those geysers later. So if you think of it as a battery, you allow the battery to be charged up in the afternoon. People use hot water, and then you only allow energy into the system at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock after the evening peak to recharge the battery. Now, that is a limitation in itself, because if you don't recharge within an hour or so, you end up with thousands of customers that are complaining about cold water. So ripple control system is a very useful load shifting energy storage mechanism. But we look at a battery it's kind of a ripple control system on steroids, because you can now change completely the time that energy storage system would be recharged. Okay. So you don't have to put the energy back in within an hour. You can wait until 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning. Or you could in fact wait until the next day if you've got a surplus of renewable energy to recharge that energy storage system. So the immediate benefit at grid scale, and you're probably asking, well, why haven't we done it yet? One of the problems,
the follow-up question was going to be what challenges have you experienced in trying to realize these opportunities? Because it sounds like there's actually a vast number of opportunities that can be realized for municipalities, especially around the Eskom issue as well. And also noting that the Eskom bill seems to be going up every year for municipalities. And I think if storage can actually come in to circumvent that or to assist to mitigate that, it's actually a great opportunity for municipalities. So what are the challenges?
Okay, so a lot of our networks, we haven't seen the right kind of investment in, let me call it, refurbishing the networks. So our networks are old, and any capital available tends to go towards replacing old transformers, replacing cables in the ground that are old and decrepit. So when you say, okay, let's invest a little bit in an energy storage system, the capital available is very limited. Now with Eskom's program, where, remember, the Eskom energy storage program was kind of a condition to one of the World Bank loans. I think perhaps if we can get that kind of funding, maybe from the Just Energy Transition from the President's office, we might be able to unlock that. But it certainly has value. The numbers are unfortunately a little bit skewed at the moment, because we work with a figure of about $400 per kilowatt hour, including the inverter and equipment that is required to make it run. And if we do our sums on the arbitrage value of 1 kilowatt hour of Eskom, of being able to shift Eskom load out, you're sitting at a sort of crossover point of about $350 per kilowatt hour. So the price of the storage needs to come down by about $50 per kilowatt hour before that business case becomes positive. And then you could make that investment purely on the savings that it's going to realize for you. Obviously, where you've got notified maximum demand penalties, that would immediately be viable. But our problem is getting the capital that you need. Unfortunately, it is very capital intensive. One of the other comparisons that we can do is we've developed an energy mix at City Power, and that kind of says we will rely on Eskom for the next 3-4 decades easily. We still require Eskom as our backup, but we can introduce renewables in the form of PV mainly. I don't think we'll get too much wind systems in Joburg because of the problems with the visual pollution of a wind turbine. But certainly our energy mix says we need to look for a certain amount of PV, we need to look for a certain amount of energy storage, and we need to look for a certain amount of dispatched generation, which is in the form of either a gas turbine, which we are looking seriously at, because it's a form of primary energy that we desperately need. Or we could also look at solar plus storage, PV plus storage. And the interesting thing is, in the analysis, if you take a 20-year term, the PV plus storage option is actually cheaper than looking for gas generation in the meantime. but it requires a massive investment. So for example, to get the quantity of generation you're looking for, let's say a 40 megawatt system, you're looking at a gas turbine system of maybe costing 1.2 billion, whereas the energy PV plus storage would cost 3-point-something billion. But over their lifetime, the PV plus storage is cheaper in terms of costs than it is for a gas turbine where you're continuously paying for fuel. So certainly energy storage at the grid level is very definitely a positive thing. Another example I could give you is we've got overloaded feeders. And if we were able to put 2 or 3 megawatts worth of energy storage on those particular feeders, we could also unlock development. We've got a very clear example, but again, it's behind the customer meter of what happened in this respect. Was we had a developer that was looking to put up a hardware megastore, and we could only give them 100 kilowatts worth of supply in a particular area because of network constraints. So we declined their application. They then came back to us and they said, look, we'll take the 100 kilowatts that you've got and we'll add 50 kilowatts worth of PV plus storage to make up the difference. And that unlocked that development. The planning engineers at City Power said, okay, it sounds like a viable option. We'll give you the 100 kilowatts from our side. You need to acknowledge that we've reduced your supply and you can't come and claim it back in the future, but go ahead with the development. So, the knock-on effect is that you had an empty stand before. Now you've got a new business there. And that's a new business that's not only paying for the energy that it does consume for City Power at a very flat load profile, which is a perfect customer, but it also now generates rates and taxes for the city. So you've always got to look at the big picture here. When you look at the business case very narrowly, it's going to look as if it's not viable. But if you take the entire system into account, it very definitely is viable. One of the problems is that we come up against is that people think that an energy storage system is a generator, and it's not. Okay, an energy storage system allows you to take any form of primary energy and use it at a different time, and that has massive DSM potential. So one of the things we are looking at is whether we can procure energy storage services as a DSM service. So in other words, we now get a service provider that may be able to come with the capital, perhaps funded through the JET IP process, and provide us an energy storage service as a DSM service. And the beauty of it as well is that it can be a containerized solution that you can move around the grid. What you find is that as you upgrade certain areas, it becomes a moving target. So if they're containerized solutions, you could forklift them and put them elsewhere on the network as part of your development plan. But again, I think maybe I've had too much time already, but we can get maybe a little bit later in the discussion the aggregated benefits, which would bring things up to utility scale, but maybe not utility connected. But certainly, if we had the capital, we would be sticking them on those intake points that have got NMD penalty issues, with the sustainable long-term business case of arbitrage, buying Eskom peak, off-peak energy the night before, and releasing that into the networks the following day during the peak period. That's where the real business case and the savings are.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Paul. That's actually a mouthful, and I think a lot of municipalities, and hopefully there are quite a few that have attended, would attest to what you're saying right now. Development is at local level, and municipalities are experiencing a lot of challenges around the power issue and not being able to increase their NMD due to the penalties that you're mentioning, and other issues between them and Eskom. So definitely, it seems like there's great opportunity around a great battery for municipalities. And of course, I do believe that the challenges that you have raised are likely, they cut across as well, across all municipalities or most municipalities in the country. So thank you so much, Paul. I'm going to move on to Lesego. Lesego did apologize to us, and again, we are very thankful that you made time, even though you're not well today. So Lesego is not going to be having her video on today due to not feeling well. But however, so Lesego, as an expert in the industry space, where do you see most of the opportunity for increasing local content of grid batteries and establishing local supply chains?
Thank you, Batandra. I hope you can all hear me. So I'm going to speak to the research that was conducted by TIPS, primarily speaking to lithium-ion batteries and vanadium redox flow batteries. And the lithium-ion battery study that we conducted was actually completed in 2020. And then currently we're finalizing the study on vanadium batteries. And both studies look at opportunities for localization of batteries in South Africa. And I think we all can attest to the fact that the country and the broader African continent actually has all battery minerals, both for the manufacturing of, for example, lithium-ion batteries, as well as vanadium batteries. And so what that means then is that the presence of these minerals provide South Africa with a comparative advantage, and it should motivate the country to actually look to exploiting localization opportunities along battery value chains. And I think particularly when you look at the lithium-ion battery value chain, we see that South Africa has actually demonstrated these pockets of competitiveness along the value chain. So for example, there is mineral beneficiation, where South Africa has shown great local capabilities. And this is specifically in manganese, nickel, and aluminium, which are all refined to battery grade. And so when you move along the value chain, you find that even though there's currently no commercial production of cells in South Africa, there is the presence of battery manufacturers as well as assembly, but this is based on imported cells from Asia. And this is a vibrant industry that consists of SMMEs, and we see that they have collaborated, for example, with academia to develop IP as well as expertise in manufacturing of components and parts in order to assist them with assembling these batteries. And so what I think this shows is that South Africa can play a competitive role in this particular segment in the lithium-ion battery value chain. And this has also demonstrated export capabilities where companies in this industry have actually been able to export some of their products. And I think an important thing to note, particularly when we think about localization, is to acknowledge that in order for localization to actually occur and in order for it to be successful, it's really important that it is adequately supported by local demand, which is something that exists in South Africa as we are facing this current crisis of load shedding. And sorry. And I think when looking at vanadium flow batteries, and I'm sure Frank is going to speak more on this, South Africa plays a significant role in the global production of vanadium, right? And looking at this, I guess it's also important again to see how we can take advantage of that and of having the mineral in the country. And the thing is, in contrast to the lithium-ion battery value chain, in South Africa, we don't actually presently have a vanadium value chain. But I think the development of the electrolyte manufacturing plant, has potential for the country to be able to be a significant player in that segment, and also to establish South Africa as a key manufacturing hub of the electrolyte outside of China, because currently China is the only country that is producing electrolyte for vanadium. And I think also, having this established electrolyte manufacturing plant serves as a catalyst for development of a local vanadium industry. But then the important thing is that it really requires government backing and government support. And I think, again, when we look at the vanadium industry, is that there are South African companies that do have the potential to produce some of the key or core components that are required in a vanadium battery, for example, your membranes, bipolar plates, inverters. But then, but then with these companies, what they need is that they would actually require investment in R&D in order to facilitate the growth and also ensure that they meet the requirements and the specifications of OEMs as well as for the industry. So again, I think that it's really important that, you know, when thinking about localization, government support is something that's really key. And in leading markets, for example, such as China and the US, we see that, you know, local battery industries are backed by large investments by the government. And unfortunately, that's something that we're not seeing in South Africa.
Yeah, I think you've already touched on the follow-up question when you're saying that we're not seeing much of the government investment or government support in the space, because the follow-up question was just to I guess find out from you what is the most what is likely hindering the development of this sector in the country, because we do have the minerals to support it. We do have, you know, perhaps it could be skills, or it could be, I guess, expertise in the space to sort of develop the industry further, or maybe we are lacking outside external investment that can actually help to, you know, move the industry forward. So what are your thoughts on that?
No, absolutely. I agree with you. I think for me, three key challenges stand out. And I think, you know, access to funding and financing remains a key hindering factor to the development of battery value chains in South Africa. And, you know, I spoke about the success of the lithium-ion battery assemblers and manufacturers. But you know, most of them have actually been able to achieve this success through limited or no government funding. So I think, you know, one can only imagine the scale and growth of these assemblers if they were to have benefited from state support or from, you know, external funding. And I think, you know, this lack of support has really hindered their growth of the industry. And I think it could also potentially constrain kickstarting off of the local vanadium industry too, because as I mentioned, you know, when you look at other countries who are looking to establish local battery industries, there's a lot of investment, I mean, billions of investment going into you know, committing to support these industries. And again, you know, we're not seeing that from South Africa. And I think another key challenge, particularly for South Africa, and this is something that we've seen with lithium-ion battery supplies, is that entering international markets such as the US, for example, and the EU has been something that's been quite challenging. And it's proven to be expensive for companies because South Africa did not have testing facilities or certification for requirements such as safety, for example, or even stability. But then what we're seeing now is that the CSIR has actually announced that they will be developing a testing and certification facility. And I think this is great because this then minimizes that challenge faced by exporters when accessing international markets. And I think that when we look to developing the vanadium redox flow battery local value chain, I think it's also important to think about, you know, testing and certification issues, especially when we look to exporting some of these batteries. And I think lastly, I think a challenge for, you know, particularly vanadium flow batteries is, I want to say, the lack of, you know, a proven local demand for the batteries due to associated risks, and also due to competition in utility scale with lithium-ion batteries, right? Because I think vanadium flow batteries have proven their feasibility and they are competitive in long duration storage and they are safer, but they still remain a risk to investors because of their high capital expenditure and also them not being as easily accessible as lithium-ion batteries. And also they also have a relatively less established supply chain compared to lithium-ion batteries and lead acid batteries, for example. So again, you know, I think government support and external support becomes really important to, you know, because you have investors who are hesitant, right, because of these technological risks. So I think to sort of mitigate against that, it becomes really important to have financial backing. And just a small note, I think also, you know, considering that, you know, this is the anticipation of like future demand, I think that there is potential risk that the VRFB, well, the vanadium battery industry, for example, may not experience expected growth, or could potentially be superseded by another emerging technology. I think those are, some of the risks and challenges to think about when we're looking to developing local battery value chains in South Africa.
Thank you so much, Lucille. I think that was actually very great. And it's mapping out quite clearly how the value chain is looking like and how it's developing, and also just understanding the differences between, available batteries in the market and what South Africa actually has access to at the moment, and the potential that we could take this industry forward. And I think it always boils down to policy. It always boils down to how our government responds to some of these technologies and how they respond to these developments. So eventually it will boil down to how much of this information and how much of the research gets incorporated into our energy planning and our energy policy in the country, so that we are able to access these opportunities, and investors are able to then come into the country and assist with the funding that we so much need. I'm going to move on to Frank as a person who has been in the space and who will likely have even more insight regarding, from a developer's perspective, what are the main obstacles that battery developers are facing in implementing grid-located projects, in your view, Frank?
Thank you, Bathandra, and good morning to everyone. Yes, I think right now there's been limited opportunities for project developers wanting to develop battery projects. To date, the only utility scale procurement that has happened is, as Richard highlighted, the direct procurement of batteries at predefined sites by Eskom, and then more recently the first round, the so-called ESIP, the Energy Storage Independent Power Producers Procurement Program, bid window 1 run by the IPP office, with bids due now early in August for the sort of 500 megawatts, 2 gigawatt hours worth of batteries, again at defined sites. So in order to participate, particularly in that window, you would have had to have a site permitted for batteries at one of the allocated substations. So that's what's happened to date so far. In terms of the private sector, there hasn't been any activity yet for building large batteries with a co-located wind or solar farm that is wheeling to a private off-taker. But having said that, we've only had a handful of large PV and wind farms built for wheeling to the private sector implemented today. But looking to the future, I think starting again with the government procurement, we do have bid window 2 of the battery round expected to come out very soon after the closing of bid window 1 or the announcement of preferred bidders. So perhaps this will be early next year. This is for significantly more capacity. It's more than 3 times the size of bid window 1, likely to be in the order of 1.7 gigawatts of batteries and around 6.4 gigawatt hours of storage. So I mean, both bid window 1 and bid window 2 are large on the international scale for procurement. So that is quite exciting, and I think it is going to lead to the development of the market. Sorry, I neglected to mention the RMIPP as well. Obviously, there were the hybrid projects bid there with PV and batteries, or even PV battery gas. One of them is under construction. One of them is expected to reach financial close at the end of this month. So there is some movement there as well. And then I think in the private sector, I think it will come. I think as the private sector gets comfortable with building large-scale generation, both to be wheeled over the grid and on site, we will see them deploying batteries as well. I think in my sense of conversations, what we're seeing is people initially procuring energy that meets their demand profile. So for example, building a wind farm and off-taking all of that energy, or building a solar farm and off-taking all of that energy. But that doesn't typically get them to very high penetrations of renewables. And I think as large industries and mining houses and large corporates consider moving to 100% renewables, we will see a second wave after this first wave where people will build more renewables co-located with storage. And then the batteries will be used to do smoothing of those loads. So this is all talking about the supply of energy, so kilowatt hours. But of course, there's a lot of other services that batteries can deliver as well. So I think, for example, what we've seen globally is growing markets for ancillary services. So whereas the batteries that are being procured in South Africa today are mostly for long duration energy applications, we are going to need batteries to provide other services, perhaps at the same time, whether that's voltage support or frequency support or inertia. We don't have a market or procurement for that yet. I suspect that will come in time. And I think as basically we develop markets for the services that batteries are provided, something that's very nascent in South Africa, we will see the number of projects being developed scale quite rapidly as well.
Yeah. And I think perhaps you've probably touched a bit on what could be hindering or challenging the industry to develop, or the private sector to develop further. But perhaps if there's anything else that you think maybe is the key thing that's limiting or posing challenges for the private sector to develop, because I mean, we always are told that in order for this energy crisis to be resolved, we need the private sector to play ball, but also the private sector requires certain things to be in place. It requires a market to be in place. It requires certain pricing methodologies to be in place. So yeah, perhaps you can also touch on that as well.
So yes, so I think exactly, if it's going to be a service provided to Eskom, so basically a transmission level service that the battery is providing, then that procurement needs to be driven by either Eskom or the IPP office. And as I say, I think that's still in its early stages, and there will be more coming. For the private sector, again, I think it's very nascent. People are still getting comfortable with the technology. Banks are still getting comfortable with the technology. Although this is being done widely overseas, the sort of scale of batteries we're also looking to build is large, and so I think we do need to get banks comfortable with funding these projects, EPCs comfortable with building the projects, IPPs comfortable with the returns and how these projects will run for the long term. I mean, depending on the different technologies as well, there's different risks. Whether some technologies have degradation risk or fire risk, other technologies take a long time to generate the returns. And so I think it's as one builds projects and creates the comfort, it will accelerate the development process. So, I do think there's a lot government can do to help push this forward more aggressively. In terms of their own procurement, it's what we saw with the REIPP, that the initial bid windows, everybody was very cautious with PV and wind projects, but it led to a really competitive environment in the later bid windows. And my expectation is the same will come with storage. The ramp rate will come. I think with political support and government support, it can be accelerated. I think it's inevitable that we will see it come.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And it's quite helpful to understand where we are at the moment in the country regarding the development of this sector, and how far we are going to go with it, and to understand the costs and the risks as well. So now I'm going to just pose questions to all of you, and I think I'll just again go back to Paul to respond first, and then have Lesego come in, and then have yourself come in. But I think you've already touched on the aspect of risks. So maybe we could just understand from your perspective, or your perspectives, what you think the risks are from a municipal perspective, what you think the risks are, Paul, and what the risks could be from an industry value chain perspective, and then later on look at the risks at a private sector generator perspective. Paul?
Thanks, Batandwa. I think Richard, if you think of physical risks, there is obviously a fire risk typically with lithium ion. But I think that's not the question you're asking. I think you're asking the question, what is the risk of the development of the industry? And tariff uncertainty is one of those things. You know, we're on the brink of opening or creating an electricity market in South Africa. And I think it creates a lot of confusion. To my mind, anybody who has a large energy storage system that can play on the demand response market already has the business case, and that's secure. Anybody who's trying to operate a system in response to tariff arbitrage, for example, may still feel a bit risky, because what's going to happen with tariffs once this market comes into play? Personally, I think that the benefit of energy storage will always have its value. But obviously a banker doesn't like that idea. If you say, we think this is going to happen in the future, they want to know this will happen in the future. So a bit of uncertainty in terms of policy there. There was also the question, why isn't energy storage sort of attracting development funding at the moment? And I think it was a question raised by Jesse. One of the issues that we had as SAISA with the last IRP is that it equated the value of battery energy storage in particular. It said this is only as valuable as putting a pumped hydro system on the transmission network somewhere. So there was all this other value of energy storage or batteries that was kind of ignored in the IRP. And I think hopefully with this iteration of the IRP, that proper value will come to the fore. What is the value of deferring distribution investment? What is the value in terms of arbitrage? You know, those are real market things that were never included in that IRP. And I think the value there will come to the fore, and that will make the investment a more clearer picture. So I think for me, the biggest risk at the moment is the uncertainty of the future of the electricity industry. To anybody who's making plans to develop or install a battery on a long-term basis. You know, we've got tons and tons of energy storage going in at residential and a lot of the smaller commercial businesses. And clearly they've made that investment because of load shedding to start off with. But you definitely need a more longer term plan. You know, if I can outline one of the ideas we were thinking of at City Power, and it goes back to utility scale rather than utility connected or grid connected battery, was the idea was to go to our top 300 key customers and convince them to each invest in a 1 megawatt battery. Okay, with the premise or the initial idea that they immediately protect themselves from load shedding. So they would put that battery in purely to ride through a load shedding session. But second to that, the base business case must be one of arbitrage. So the ability of a municipality to properly manage time of use tariffs comes to the fore here, because we buy power on a time of use tariff with Eskom. If we can pass that time of use tariff on to our customers, now we can get them to behave in a way that benefits the entire system, but we need to find the value that can be unlocked by doing that. So the base arbitrage business case needs to be there, and that's a bit risky at the moment. And then also in the longer term future, say those top 300 customers have all installed that battery, and they've given me control of that battery with our SCADA system. Now all of a sudden I have access to a 300 megawatt battery, and I can start to manipulate the load and the production from that battery to avoid load shedding completely. So there would be a great benefit there. You know, if I had a 300 megawatt, 1200 megawatt hour battery at the moment, I could protect the city of Joburg from load shedding. But I need to find somebody who's going to make that investment. And obviously the private sector is the one that's got the money at the moment. So now it becomes a matter of working together with them. There was another question of, are we considering allowing batteries within our network to run as an island? Yes, definitely. That would be part of this top 300 key customer program. And then finally, once we've got SCADA control of it, once load shedding is over, and I believe we will get to a point where we don't have load shedding anymore, then the value of that energy storage
Mhm.
system in the auxiliaries market, if I can put it that way, or in the demand response market. And at that point in time, City Power would share that benefit with its end consumers. So it's a tradable thing, and it also goes towards the establishment of this market in South Africa. If I've got a 300 megawatt battery that I can dispatch at the behest of the system operator, it has a huge value. And I think we've got to think of those future business plans and start talking about them in a big way to make sure this investment does in fact start to happen right now. If we don't get our own local industry going, I think that's a big problem as well. So we definitely
Yeah.
have got the local companies that are doing great, but it's more at the smaller scale, down at the end consumer, the battery for the PV systems that are going in. You know, we did a study in Joburg to try and look at the solar water heaters that we've installed. And we've used a bit of, together with the UJ, they developed software that can identify what a solar water heater looks like. And we asked them to teach the software how to recognize a PV system as well. So we know exactly where all the PV systems are. And it looks as if in the northern suburbs of Joburg, you've got over 18,000 PV systems installed. And I can tell you now that does include a battery. And if I can give the right tariff signals to those suburbs clients, I would already have 20 megawatts worth of energy storage at my disposal. But again, that's related to getting the right time of use tariffs in. So you either coordinate the use of energy storage on your network through time discriminated tariffs, time of use tariffs, or you coordinate its function by convincing that customer to allow you to control it and achieve scale as a result.
Thank you for that, Paul. I think we are sort of getting closer to the 11-hour mark, so I'm going to try and rush things a bit so that we can get to do a Q&A or have some of the questions that have been posed responded to. But I'm also hoping, because you actually gave quite an extensive response, so I'm hoping some of the responses that you gave will respond to some of the questions that came through. But also, if you can also check the Q&A, I think there are some questions that are directly are referring to you or directed at you that you can just type answers to as well. Lesego, I know that I was asking about risks, but I think if you can, whilst you're touching on the risks, but also look at what are the cost trends and to what extent are grid batteries are getting cheaper, and if batteries increase the cost of grid power. So if maybe you could, whilst you're looking at risk, but also look at costs as well, because I think this is quite relevant to you as well as somebody who's looking at the value chain of batteries and also looking extensively on the industry development as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Bathandwa. I think that, Paul is right about the initial risks of battery technologies and, the need for us to get a local industry going. And I think when you're looking at battery technologies, I mean, all of them, whether you look at lithium-ion batteries, vanadium, sodium sulfur batteries, they all lead acid batteries as well. They all present some sort of risk, and these are both technical risks and economic risks. But I think from, a localization perspective, I think a risk for the industry is not being able to take advantage of localization opportunities and in creating a local industry. And so the risk now becomes flooding the market with imported batteries or depending on imported batteries in order to meet local demand. And I think right now the reality is that we are in this crisis and there is a need to act quickly in the short run. But I think it's also important that while we're acting, it's important to think about how can we develop local players to scale up and enable them to be competitive in the local market and also to benefit from state procurement programs for battery energy storage, right? Because we've seen that particularly for local assemblers and manufacturers, they are able to provide batteries for specialized and niche markets as well as for behind the meter applications. But when it comes to utility scale applications, for example, we fall short. And what that means is that when it comes to state procurement programs for utility scale, South African local manufacturers are not able to compete. So how then can they best be assisted in order to grow in scale and be able to supply for utility scale market instead of us having to rely on imports? And I think the same can be said for vanadium batteries as well, in that I did acknowledge that we might not have an industry, and in the long run, maybe we might look to imports. But I think it's also important that because we have recognized that we do have some components and parts that can be sourced locally, we need to prioritize those parts again in the short run, because it's possible to, for example, look into importing the cell stack, but then what localized parts can be sourced locally is something that is important to look at. And I think also there's a risk of getting left behind, and I think that's an important risk, because I think particularly when looking at where South Africa was in terms of its lithium ion battery industry, and having developed that at the CSIR in terms of research back in the 70s, for a country that was in the forefront of that technology, we are kind of behind looking at some of the manufacturers. So I think, when it comes to, for example, vanadium batteries, it's important to take some of those learnings and see, how can we actually develop this industry? Because again, as I mentioned, that with some of the components that we're producing being the electrolyte outside of China, we're the only country. So how do we actually capitalize on that and ensure that we're able to, be part of this emerging technology? And I think when it comes to the cost, I think, again, speaking from a localization perspective, the costs have gone down significantly, and I don't quite remember the data, but it's been very, very significant. Even though I guess, some might argue that this might not be enough. And we've seen in the last year or so, I think, because of Russia's invasion on Ukraine, that's led to the disruption of supply chains for battery minerals. And that has unfortunately led to an increase in the batteries, as well as the increase in demand, right? Because especially for lithium ion batteries, most of the demand actually comes from electric vehicles. It doesn't come from stationary storage, but obviously we're seeing a demand in that as well. And so this also contributes to that increase of cost. But in terms of for example, looking at localization, it can actually be an avenue where, we see potential for cost reductions. And I guess that also speaks to the trend we're seeing, where we see, especially when it comes to battery manufacturing, it's usually produced, I guess, closer to home, right? So in that way, you're able to minimize some of the costs. And I mentioned vanadium batteries, and with that, vanadium is very volatile, and the price of the vanadium and electrolyte makes up a significant portion of the battery. And so what localizing that could mean is that there's a potential to actually be able to offer vanadium at a cost competitive price locally. So that's something that could be looked at. And again, on the vanadium battery value chain, you have strategic business models, for example, such as looking at the renting or leasing of the electrolyte, that could be very important to actually reducing the high capital expenditure of vanadium batteries. And on lithium ion batteries, there's a company named Revolve, and I think some people may be familiar with it. And they offer second life batteries for storage. And I think, that makes lithium ion batteries a lot more affordable compared to purchasing a new battery. So I think, some of those different models and offerings, as well as looking at localization, are important considerations to see, how we're able to reduce costs for these batteries that are very important for grid storage applications. And I think also just in terms of, looking at technologies and their trajectory. I mean, I'm hoping that with lithium-ion batteries as well as vanadium batteries, despite some of the, external shocks that impact on, supply chains, that, costs are expected to still come down in the future. So yeah, hopefully that is something that is still possible.
Yeah. Thank you, Lesego. And then just quickly, Frank, so with all this that's been already said, I think you started when you were summarizing, you mentioned the risks already from a developer perspective, and Paul touched on those from a local government perspective or just broadly government perspective, and Lesego just touching on that as well. So from you, I think it would be interesting to find out, as somebody who's in the developer space, whether you think, or does it look maybe from modeling or from data, whether prices will come down, whether battery storage, I think most importantly, if battery storage will increase grid energy costs, and what are the assumptions that can be made about prices in the sector?
So I think it's inevitable pricing will continue to fall. I think what's more interesting is that we're going to see more and more technologies in the storage space come to the fore. We obviously have lithium-based technologies as prevalent at the moment, but there is so much money being poured into research of other technologies that we're going to see these come into the market as well. And what I think we'll start seeing is different batteries being deployed for different applications. Lithium is extremely well suited for mobile applications, cars, phones, laptops, and the like. It actually isn't the ideal technology for stationary storage. So in the stationary storage domain, I'm obviously still a fan of vanadium redox flow batteries from my Bushveld days, and the opportunities that Lesego has already unpacked for that technology in South Africa. But there's many others. There's sodium ion, there's liquid metal batteries, there's gravity batteries. And I think all of these will develop and find their place. Of course, pump storage as well as a well-recognized technology. And in each domain, we will see the price for that application fall. I think what we're also going to see more and more of is the realization that batteries don't have to do just one thing. I think at the moment, most people, when they think batteries, they think, load shedding backup. We have discussed on this call a bit about how that batteries can unlock additional grid capacity, but each of when the battery has a use case or an application, the more applications you can have the battery do, the better the value proposition for the battery is. And for example, if you're a consumer or commercial customer, you might be thinking, well, I'm going to buy the battery for load shedding. But what happens if load shedding solved in 2 years? What's my battery going to do that I spent all the money on? But and so a lot of the modeling work I've worked on in the past has shown that might be the primary use now. But depending on how prevalent load shedding is into the future, the battery can then be used to capture extra solar energy. So if you overbuild a solar plant on site, you can use that to charge the battery during the day rather than the grid. And then you can use the battery to offset, to do tariff arbitrage. So discharge the battery in peak hours to avoid those really high peak tariffs. I mean, in some municipalities, peak tariffs in winter are well over R7 a kilowatt hour now. So it's, your peak hour bill in winter can be horrific. And then another use case is peak demand charges. So again, a commercial customer being hit with peak demand charges can use, if they say, for example, like a shopping center, when the air conditioners all turn on in the morning, there might be quite a peak that settles down. So you could have the battery doing all these things, peak demand reduction, tariff arbitrage, increased renewables penetration, while also available to do backup protection against load shedding. And when you stack all of the value of each of those issues, then you can end up with a very viable commercial project. And similarly at the utility scale.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you so much, Frank. I think we do have time for a Q&A. And I think when I'm looking at the Q&A here, some of the questions have been responded to, but I think they're direct questions to Paul And to you, Frank, and I think there was a question around the costs, and I think we've already covered the cost aspect. Just one that I'm seeing here, Frank, is asking if the Bushveld Minerals vanadium flow battery installed at the Vametco mine near to being fully commissioned.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't wear a Bushveld hat, so I'm not really in a position to comment, but I won't say anything about what you see behind my head. Maybe that's a hint.
Oh, well, that's fine. And then there was one that was directly referring to COJ Power. So it's asking if will COJ Power look at PV plus storage, storage being grid forming technology coupled with an operating regime so that subsystems can be powered in islanded mode. Paul, would you be able to respond to that?
Kandwa, yeah, I can. Remember that key customer program requires that you would allow them to run as a power island. One of the prime targets for me at the moment would be to go to all those shopping centers that have put PV on their rooftop, convince them to make the investment or somehow get the energy storage systems at that shopping center and start to use it for arbitrage for their benefit as well as ours. Now, my bosses would probably kill me for this because as Frank has just mentioned, one of the use cases is demand control. So we're in an industry now that's shifting towards tariff changes because we need to increase the revenues from fixed network charges, if I can put it that way. And almost by default, City Power, from our large power user perspective, we've probably got a much more favorable ratio of fixed demand charges to energy charges, which is the ratio that you need to fix. At the moment, I think Eskom is sitting at about 70% energy charges and 30% network charges. A lot of utilities around the world are more at 50-50. But what it means is that your energy storage system now becomes very useful as managing that maximum demand or managing those network charges. So if I work out the arbitrage value for City Power on the Eskom Megaflex tariff, I come to a sort of best number of about R1.80 per kilowatt hour. If I look and if I run the same sort of modeling on my customers' tariffs, the value of that 1 kilowatt hour of energy storage is closer to R4, but it's not so much the energy shifting part that's the dominant factor. It's the demand management side of it. So they can in fact earn up to R4 per kilowatt hour energy storage by programming it firstly to cap demand, maximum demand, and secondly to do energy arbitrage. So I think it's again, it depends on the load of the business. Maybe one of the things we're missing in the industry is the ability to examine a load profile and make a recommendation of what the best investment would be. And that would apply both at utility scale as well as behind the meter stuff. So maybe that's part of the industry development that has to come. You know, the last point I'd made on my little notes here for these questions was, in fact, trying to educate the customers. And I think the likes of IISD, as well as GIZ and a lot of other industry players, you know, these guys have realized that the information pertaining to how an energy storage system can be used needs to be put in a way that the general public can understand it. And I think once that penny drops, also you're going to find investment will pick up dramatically. I think business is hesitant at the moment. There's a solution to protect yourself from load shedding and to make this investment future-proof. But the uptake at the moment is not very good. I think possibly because the understanding of how these things can work is not there just yet. So things like this webinar are excellent to do that, and a lot of effort from people that are working with SAISA as well to try and get the knowledge out there. I think that's key. Thanks.
Yeah. it's very, very important to get the knowledge out there. I think I'll take 2 more questions. I think they might be the last questions because we now only have 7 minutes before 11. And I think they are for, okay, now I've lost this question. Where did it go? It just vanished. Okay, not sure where it went, but there is one that is asking about mine operators in South Africa looking at BESS as a possible solution to challenges of outages. I'm not sure if Lesego, you could maybe touch on that.
Thanks. So I'm gonna touch on the question by Yusuf, and hopefully it also
Yes,
links
that's the one
to
I was looking for.
hopefully it also links to maybe answering Avinash's question, but not sure about that. I think when looking at sorry, let me just have a look at the question. Okay, can't find it. But I think when looking at the business case for storage technologies or lithium-ion batteries or vanadium batteries, it really depends on what the company requires, right? So in terms of like the technical requirements, especially if cost is not an issue. So are you looking for a system for auxiliary services or backup? And I think it's also important to consider, especially for, I guess, mining companies in South Africa, you know, ESG requirements are something that are really important. So, you know, when you're looking at maybe the supply chains or the value chains of some of these technologies, are these technologies that have negative environmental externalities that could potentially impact on, for example, your ESG scores or profile. So I really think it does depend on what you're looking at. But I think, for example, when you look at vanadium batteries, I think there is definitely a business case for such a battery for South Africa's mining industry because of some of the benefits of vanadium batteries compared to lithium-ion batteries, you know, that being that they're safe, the, you know, them being long duration storage, because for mining companies, for example, you know, it's able to provide the company with almost, you know, 24 hours of continuous power because of the system being able to provide, you know, backup power for at least up to 12 hours. So I think those are some of the key things that one needs to think about for, you know, energy storage technologies, because it's really not a one size fits all. And it really depends on, you know, what you're trying to use the system to achieve and how you can actually make it work.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. So that response was bundling the question from Yusuf and the question around mines. Lesego?
I'm sorry, so it was mostly for Yusuf, but in terms of mines, so there are a couple of South African mining companies. I can't think of them from the top of my head, but hoping that some of the panels will assist, that are actually looking to storage solutions for, you know, potential backup, because they also have to think about, for example, CBAM or, you know, the EU Green Deal, and how it becomes important for especially exporters to be able to use clean energy to generate some of the manufacturing products or mining products that South Africa sells. So there are companies looking at that. I'll just check quickly if I can find some of the names and also the commitments that they have made, and I'll share with Avinash. Thank you.
Yeah, yes, I think Frank can come in quickly there because I think he might actually have this information and be able to respond.
Yeah. So just specifically on the mining sector, you know, I can't disclose names, but there are likely to be some of the first big battery procurement tenders run by some of the majors this year still, if that goes well. But I think generically it goes back to what I said before, is that the strategy that I saw, if it was summarized for the mining sector and for big industrial customers, is phase one is build renewables to take up as much energy as they can during the day and for wind in the morning and evening. And phase two is to build even more renewables with batteries. So I think initially, because batteries perhaps are more challenging to bank, looking to do PV and battery, like PV and wind first. And that is, we've seen the first big projects coming online. There's a lot in the pipeline, but it's something new and challenging, and it hasn't been absolutely smooth sailing getting those projects over the line, but they are coming. And I think as we see more and more projects built, we'll see even more projects built. So I do believe there's a tsunami of large renewables projects, and then another tsunami behind that of even more with storage. That's my view of what's coming in the market. But yeah, once the first procurement actually happens in the mining sector for large batteries, which as I say, hopefully some of those first tenders will be out still this year, that will then lead to growth in that sector.
Yeah, it always just requires just one person to take the jump, and then everybody follows. So thank you very much to Paul, Lesego, and Frank for joining us and sharing all that insight today. Colleagues that are participating in this webinar, please remember to check out the report and keep track of our tweet feed from the ISD Energy team. We will share this recording, and we'll likely share the presentation as well. And also look out for part 2, because part 2 is going to answer a lot of the questions that were raised today, as it's going to delve deeper into this topic that we're discussing, and look more specifically on solutions that are industry specific, looking at municipalities, looking at developers, and looking at the value chain of the battery sector. So just quickly, it's 11 o'clock. I think I'll just hand over to Richard Halsey for maybe a half a minute to just give us a closing remarks and a vote of thanks for today. Otherwise, from me, I'm signing off. I think my time has ended. Thank you very much again, colleagues, for joining.
Thanks, Batandwa. Don't worry, I won't keep you more than a couple of seconds. All I got to say is, again, a big thank you. Not only have Paul, Frank, and Lesego helped out today, they've been enormously useful and kind and generous with their time in other parts of the project, and do a lot of great work in general in their respective areas. I've also interviewed, almost 50 people for this work so far, and there have been a lot of helpful people in the energy space. So I'm not going to name everyone, obviously, but thanks to those people. And on that note, if anyone listening does want to have any input to part 2, we are some of that work's done, but some is carrying on. I put my email in the chat. If you are interested in sharing your knowledge, please do so. And I think that's it. Eskom weren't able to join today, but I have had some very productive and interesting conversations with Eskom representatives, so their opinions definitely will be reflected in the part 2 as well. And that's it. Please do reach out to us if you have any questions. And thanks for attending.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.